All right, welcome to our panel entitled Art as Action, Politics and the Creative Impulse. I'm Henrik Schatzinger, co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, along with my co-director, Brian Smith, who's over there. We thought 4 p.m. on a Friday, that would be a good time to separate the wheat from the chaff, and look at you guys. What an amazing turnout. Thank you all for being here today. Of course, we chose that time simply because we wanted to make it possible to have our distinguished guests here today. So I want to thank the art department and Raphael Salas for approaching the center and bringing such interesting and accomplished panelists to Ripon College. It's been really great working with Raphael on this, and we look forward to hearing from and working with other departments in the future. This panel brings together artists and curators who create artwork that engages with political action and protest. Our time in history is one of political upheaval as well as social unrest. Many of the seminal moments in art history have come from artists willing to take a stand amid such adversity. Artists act as a mirror to a society and observe and participate in moments of political importance. For the introduction of our artists and curators, I will now turn to Raphael Salas, Associate Professor of Art here at Ripon College, who will not only introduce our panelists, but who has also kindly agreed to moderate the panel today. Thank you also for doing that. After our discussion, we will have a chance for you to ask questions, and then we'll go from there. All right. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming once again. Just to give you the lay of the land, what we'll do is I'll have our panelists, they're all going to present a few moments of their own work individually, and then after they all do that, we'll have a few questions that I prepared, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, okay? I do have a couple images I want to show you as an introduction to the topic, and then I'll introduce our panelists. And the panelists are going to present from over here because we have a crowd of them, so I'll kind of shuttle back and forth to keep everybody in line. I need my clicker. The intersection of art and politics in the West is quite recent, in fact. Only since the Enlightenment have artists focused on political action within their artistic practice. Francisco Goya's, I guess I should have learned how to do this stuff. Francisco Goya's artwork describing the disasters of war, or Honoré Daumier's depiction of the strength of the free press, are indelible examples of how art can communicate a political viewpoint. These images remain as powerful as they once were, as the free press is openly antagonized in our country right now, and the world continues to suffer under the oppressive regimes in Myanmar, Syria, and many other places. Similarly, the bombing in Guernica in Spain in 1937 was depicted here by Pablo Picasso. A reproduction of it was infamously covered up with blue curtains in advance of Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations, where he was giving his recommendation to go to war against Saddam Hussein following the September 11 attacks. The censorship of the image stands as a testimonial to its power to communicate social injustice. That said, art that engages with the political is varied in approach and within its own goals. The art of protest can be seen as political. Art that acts as nationalist propaganda is political. And I put these two images together not to connect Barack Obama with communism, but because the goals of these images are actually very similar. And if you compare them visually, they have many of the same attributes. Art that is personal is political. And all of these artworks with their varied goals could be considered examples of political art. This panel brings together artists and curators who create artwork that engages with political action and protest. Some of the discussion and images that we're going to see contain violent imagery. Our panelists are Thailand Soil. Thailand Soil is a figurative painter who focuses on identity, and race. His work has been exhibited nationally, and he'll be included in an exhibit at the Detroit Museum of Contemporary Art this fall. Sawyer holds an MFA from the New York Academy of Art, and he teaches at Oakland Community College and the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. Brandon Bauer, at the far end, uses art as a space for critical and ethical inquiry, to explore themes of social justice, democracy, war, and as an exploration of embedded cultural histories. Bauer holds a master and an MA and MFA in intermedia art from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and is currently an associate professor of art at St. Norbert College. And Jay Gao in the center combines allegory and storytelling into printmaking, drawing, and large-scale installation. Gao uses her cross-disciplinary background as a teaching tool for projects that are inseparable from the long-term health, equity, ethics, and economics of the places we live and share with one another. She holds a BFA in printmaking and drawing from Washington University in St. Louis, and works as an independent curator, artist, and educator. So please greet our panelists for Ripon College. And give me just a second to get our PowerPoint here. Okay, our first panelist will be Brandon Bauer. Oh, the clicker. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to thank the Center for Politics and the People for hosting this panel. I want to thank Raphael for inviting me. I wanted to start with this quote, and this is not a direct quote, it's more of an adapted quote. Without ethical consciousness, an artist is only a decorator. The quote comes from Robert Motherwell, he was a painter with the abstract expressionists, and his quote was more directly, without ethical consciousness, a painter is only a decorator. But I do feel that it fits for artists of all stripes. And interestingly enough, when the ancient Greeks were kind of devising systems of philosophy and branches of philosophy, they put aesthetics in the same category as ethics. And they did that because they felt that both of those required a really advanced kind of sense of judgment. And so, you know, even from kind of ancient times, there's been this recognition that art and ethics are really uniquely tied. I want to start with this image. This is an engraving by Paul Revere at the early part of the American Revolution, the bloody massacre perpetrated in King Street, Boston. And this is a good example of how art as this social critical practice really was born with the idea of democracy. Before that, you know, artists were really beholden to the powerful, you know, making work for the kings, making work for religious authority. But with the idea of democracy and with the idea of a government that could be run by the people and for the people, you know, artists took a more critical stance towards power and put themselves in the position of, how would we as a people, govern ourselves and guide ourselves? And you see that in many of the graphics in the early American Revolution. Paul Revere here, as you see, early American revolutionary, and depicting, this atrocity that was perpetrated by the British. And I wanted to start with this also just as a way to kind of look at, analytically, this motif that crops up again and again in art history, especially since this time. You see here, this, line of soldiers firing on the crowd. The crowd has no weapons, and so our sympathies are with the victims of this atrocity, the victims of this violence, and that's, it's meant to do that. It's meant to, have us kind of side with the oppressed, with the powerless, especially in this fight for independence, in this fight, against, the king. And to, create this new form of government that is run, by the people. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. Back to Francisco Goya, as Raphael had kind of introduced. Now again, here's an artist who was really dealing with some very heavy kind of social political concerns in his time. This is a very famous painting, The 3rd of May, dealing with the Napoleonic invasion of the Spanish Peninsula. But again, we see that same motif, and even more explicitly than the Paul Revere engraving. I mean, these soldiers are faceless. We are not to identify with them. The highlight is on, the man standing with his arms outstretched. He's defenseless. He has no weapon. This is an atrocity committed against civilians. So our sympathies are to be drawn to the oppressed, to the people who are, being kind of put under, these kinds of actions. And here we see a painting by Picasso from 1951, the Massacre in Korea. And Picasso was responding to news reports of the day, specifically of the Sinchon Massacre, which still, there's a lot of dispute about what actually happened, but what it was this village that was completely decimated. They still don't know whether it was North Korean forces or Allied forces or anything like that. But again, we see this same motif coming up. And again, we're supposed to sympathize and we're supposed to be on the side of those people who are kind of suffering under the boot of power in a sense. And this is an image. This is a documentary photograph. It's not meant as art. But from a Black Lives Matter protest in Baton Rouge. And you see, again, that same kind of motif and that same schema. And you see the line of riot police, and there's all these discussions, especially after Ferguson, about the militarization of the police. And you see them, confronting this woman who, again, is unarmed. She's standing with a lot of kind of dignity and grace, but she's not in armor. She has no weapon. And there was a lot of really interesting kind of image analysis of this image after it was published in the press. People were talking about, there's almost this kind of supernatural kind of way that this image was. The police confronting her are almost kind of pushed back, and so there was some very interesting kind of image analysis about this. But again, we see this kind of similar motif. And while this was a documentation, photojournalist documentation of a protest not meant as art, we do see with this that same image starts coming into art again. And again, it's that same kind of motif. And it's paired with this quote by Frederick Douglass: "The limit of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." Again, getting back to that same idea that, whose side should we be on? We should be looking at, those who are struggling for their dignity, those who are struggling for democracy, those who are struggling for a greater share of, the society in which they're a part of. And this is by a printmaker, Meredith Stern, who's part of a collective of artists all throughout the United States and Mexico called Just Seeds. And she did a whole series basically illustrating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm going to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about my own work and where where my work kind of came from and what I've been doing. This is an image from 2001. In the 90s, I went to school as an undergraduate at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, and I was a painting major. But I always wanted my work to engage with, the things that were going on in the world. I didn't want it to be separated. I wanted it to say something. And a lot of things that were going on globally, kind of in the 90s, were pretty horrific. The Rwanda genocide, the war in the Balkans, and this discussion of ethnic cleansing and things like that. And so I really wanted to try to connect with that and make meaningful work about this, these kind of atrocities, and really try to, open people's eyes who maybe didn't want to think about those kinds of things. And after September 11th, and especially during the run-up to the war in Iraq, I just kind of got to a point where I felt like, staying in my studio, secluded, working on a painting for a month, wasn't going to engage with the public in the way that I wanted to, in the way that I felt compelled to, especially with the kind of run-up to the war in Iraq. And so I began making a series of flyers and just posting them on the street, and they were drawn from my paintings and my printmaking work, and then just, kind of simply photocopied and put out, and just trying to insert, another voice into the public square, into the street. And this is another example of a street project I did. It was called, it was a sticker that I made. It said "More dead and wounded every day," and it was created. I made 1,000 of them. It was created to mark the 1,000th U.S. casualty in the war in Iraq. And I just placed them, all around, so that people kind of getting out of their car, or going to work, or going to get that cup of coffee would maybe think for a minute, like, there's a war going on in our name, and people are dying, in our name, and just trying to bring attention to that. I was also very fortunate to take part in this project. I co-edited a book called Peace Signs, the Anti-War Movement Illustrated, and it was a fantastic project in that we documented this global kind of outpouring of graphic work that happened during the run-up to the war in Iraq. And it was a very unique time. I mean, most times when you see anti-war kind of work in art history, it's always, after an atrocity, or after, as we saw with Picasso's Massacre in Korea, responding to, news events or things like that. Or even with Francisco Goya's Disaster of Wars, it was made decades after that happened. But this was this kind of international, global outpouring of graphic work that tried to stop the war before it started. And so in that, it's really kind of a unique document looking at that particular time. And through all of this, I became connected with artists and designers all over the world and all over the country, just doing interesting projects and trying to, make statements about, a whole variety of kind of issues. And I became connected with the Just Seeds organization as well, and started participating in some of their projects. And they put out this poster series called the Celebrate People's History poster series, which was really just trying to make these, kind of celebrate these small moments and these social movements and these ways of kind of pushing democracy and ideas kind of forward in different ways. And I created this poster about the Milwaukee 14, which was a group of priests and ministers who during the Vietnam War broke into a selective service office, and they took a bunch of draft records, and they ended up burning them in this public park in Milwaukee with homemade napalm. And you can see this is a picture of some images we pasted on the street, and here's another Celebrate People History poster celebrating Muhammad Ali. Not only as this kind of sports icon, but also as this kind of civil rights icon and anti-war icon during the Vietnam era as well. And through this, I got connected with a group of kind of international artists who all have been doing very kind of political work on the street. And we all participated in this exhibition at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art called The Interventionists, which was curated by a great curator, Nato Thompson, who does a lot of work related to social and political kind of action, especially as it relates to the public sphere. And I participated in this gigantic kind of wall of street art, in which collected kind of this work from all over the world, people working in this way. And we made this kind of gigantic mural in this old industrial space that had been converted into a contemporary art museum. And more recently, I've been working on work primarily critical of nuclear weapons. And I began this work in 2013. Again, just thinking about critical histories and thinking about social movements and thinking about, kind of resurrecting some critical histories that, maybe have been overlooked. And of course now with the issues going on with North Korea and the kind of rhetoric that's going back and forth about nuclear weapons. This work has become more and more kind of present. But I began with a series called the Euro Missiles Crisis, which looked at the nuclear abolition movement from the 1980s and all the kind of social and political issues that were going on, as well as the nuclear freeze movement and other people who are kind of struggling against the arms race at the time. Oops. And this is an image from a installation in the Frank Juarez Gallery. And I had there's 22 images in the full suite Euro Missile Crisis series, and I had them all broken up kind of in a timeline going throughout the gallery. And at this point in the early 80s, 1982, I also set up this voting booth in which people could participate and kind of re-vote this nuclear disarmament referenda, which Wisconsin was the first state in the country to actually put nuclear disarmament to a citizen's vote. They got it on the ballot, and it happened as well around the country in other states and municipalities. But basically asked people, do you want to negotiate with Russia to stop the arms race and start dismantling our nuclear weapons? And it was pretty astonishing, especially given the kind of rhetoric that Reagan was having at that time and the way that the arms race was really ramping up. And so much so that the nuclear freeze movement, by the time of Reagan's second term, he became, like an arms control, going from a hawk, arms race hawk to arms control kind of person. So there was a lot of effect from this nuclear abolition movement, which still to this day created the largest single-issue political protest in American history, the March for Nuclear Disarmament in 1982. Beyond that, I've been really thinking about nuclear weapons in more kind of critical and metaphoric ways, and I began a series called 1000 Suns, in which I went through all of the original test film from the U.S. above ground testing program, and I would stop for each of the tests, the film at the point of the brightest kind of explosive flash. Because many people, when they think of nuclear weapons, they think of the mushroom cloud, as this kind of image of fear or threat or the kind of danger of nuclear weapons. But really, it is that kind of moment of that brightest explosive flash that is that moment of that kind of terror. But I also saw it as these kind of color field images that are almost indiscernible because of that. Almost as this metaphor for that limit of vision of testing and thinking that nuclear weapons were somehow a good idea to let loose in the world. And this is an example of this work in exhibition out of Howard Community College in Columbia, Maryland. And I've done a number of other works. You can kind of see some documentation of a 2-channel video installation I did as well, dealing kind of critically looking at the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima. And just in that work, especially dealing with nuclear weapons and thinking about that in terms of kind of ethics and applied ethics, really got me down a path of really thinking about how to make kind of ethical images. And when ISIS was kind of going around, and we were seeing all of the ISIS kind of beheading videos in the news and things like that, I started really thinking about what are the ethics of kind of those images and the use of those images in the media, and the fact that they were kind of replayed over and over and over again. And essentially they're drawn from propaganda. They're drawn from this organization's propaganda, and we keep replaying like the images they want us to see. And so this was an exhibition that was held here at Ripon College called Landscapes of Absence, in which I took images from the ISIS beheading videos and I erased all of those kind of dehumanized images of these victims of that violence, leaving nothing but the landscape. Kind of again, is this metaphor of like, what do we really know about these places or what these people are suffering other than, what they're telling us, which is, also, of course, not accurate. Oops. And I wanted to show this just as an example of some of how this comes through in my teaching projects and things like that. This was a project that I engaged with my students in one of my intermediate photography courses, and it's called Bringing the War Home Restaged. And what we did is we went through the college archives and we looked and we found these images of Vietnam War protest on the St. Norbert campus, and we restaged the image and kind of brought it into the present. But in doing so, we also did a lot of research, about what that movement was on campus, about larger issues relating to the Vietnam War, and did a lot of research as well as developing this and then putting together an exhibition. Oh. Finally, I just want to end with this. If you are interested in these ideas, especially related to art and politics, I'm the lead organizer and curator of an exhibition of artists we're bringing in from Austria in the spring, Oliver Ressler, who deals with social movements, documenting social movements, specifically kind of from inside and looking at how they organize themselves and how they do what they do. And he's documented the climate justice movement, Occupy Wall Street, and a number of other social movements. And he's going to be exhibiting both at St. Norbert College and at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. And we're going to have panel discussions as well and things like that relating to art and politics and kind of social action. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brandon. Did you two figure out who's next?
Going next.
Jenny won the arm wrestling.
Obviously.
Our next presenter is Jenny Gao. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Raphael. Well, thank you again for welcoming me here today. So my name is Jenny Gao, and I am self-employed as an artist, curator, educator, entrepreneur. I don't know if I've hit my quota for syllables yet, but one comment I get frequently in my work is that I do a lot of different things. And in some ways that's true. I've had a pretty dense and diverse career path. But underlying all of the work is the same motivation, the same purpose, and that's what I'm going to be going over today, and what that purpose is. So as an artist and a curator specifically, I believe that my work is about bringing together the parts of the whole. This is about connection, and that's all creativity is connecting different pieces of information to create a new whole. So this first part, the sensitive clicker.
It is sensitive.
I'll get used to it. But so, as an artist and a curator, one of the things that I love about what I get to do is change the spaces that we interact with. And so this is an example of one of my public art projects. I was an artist in residence at the Madison Public Library, and I created this installation of migrating passenger pigeons flying over the children's area of the library. And this is specifically a project that the community needed to be involved in. They donated old clothing that would have otherwise been discarded. They helped in the creation of the birds themselves. And then for me, as the artist then, it was about, well, okay, why? Why are we creating these birds, and what is their function here? And so in the making of this work, I was doing a lot of research on how these birds move. And so going back again, this is all about connecting the parts of the whole. And at this time, the Women's March was going on, the protests were building up in the early part of 2017. And so I was studying these birds that move in flocks of thousands, known as murmurations. And so the passenger pigeon specifically, they're actually a bird that went extinct over 100 years ago. There used to be 5 billion of them in North America, They flew in flocks by the millions. So if any of you have ever seen starlings fly in flocks by the thousands, imagine that, but now extending for miles. It's pretty incredible. And so they went extinct. And they went extinct because of overhunting and because we didn't have environmental policies in place at that time to protect the migration routes of these animals. And so what I was wanting to know in making this work was, what is the function of moving in unison? Essentially, these flocks are pure democracies. There is no single bird that is capable of leading a flock this big. And so they're just responding to their neighbors' movements to be able to do this and not crash into one another. And it's an active defense. You don't see predatory animals acting in this way in nature. You see schools of fish moving that need that group protection. You see smaller birds, songbirds, moving like this. And so that tells us something about the function of democracy. The individual alone is weak, but the individual in the group becomes strong. I emphasize the individual because this isn't an either or, whereas, well, okay, so the individual important is the whole important. It's not an either or, it's both. And maybe in a little more upbeat way, each of the birds got a name. So one of my former students actually named this one Genesis. Most of the birds got named after different activists and important figures in environmentalism. So we've got Martin after Martin Luther King here, and Gaylord after Gaylord Nelson, who founded Earth Day. And so it was important that when the community got involved in this, they all helped on working on the same bird. And so I'd have a family working on the same bird. I'd have a group of friends working on the same bird. Or whichever group decided to volunteer together that day, they'd be working on the same bird. It wasn't an assembly line where, say, one person works on wings, another person works on tails. They're working on the same bird. They're going to recognize, essentially, the beacon that they've created when they come next to a library. And these are clothes that would have otherwise been thrown away. These are mass-manufactured, overproduced items that end up in our landfills and can't be recycled. And I think inherently the challenge of community art, of any art that's addressing a social issue, is essentially getting disheartened about it, right? And so in this case, it's like, okay, we are working with a flawed material, but that material is still worth working with and bringing together. And the final result of this is something that causes people to look up in wonder when they walk through the space. They can't not engage with the project without looking up. And so this is a book that I created called The Golden Cage. It's all woodcut, illustrated. And the book is about a homing pigeon who leaves behind his home. He leaves behind what he knows in search of greater purpose. He instead gets a job delivering packages of no value to people with no heads. And so he's taught that if he works hard, he will ascend in his career. And so that's what he does. And his reward for all of his hard work is to live in a golden cage. He gets promoted. Right? He lives in a golden cage, and he now delivers messages of no value from the heads that have long since been disconnected from the bodies they try to lead. I swear I'm going to get a hold of this. So he's in a position now where he sees the disconnect between the heads and the bodies, and he comes to believe that human beings need to be united. The heads and the bodies need to be reconnected. And the question then that the book poses is, what are you willing to risk of what you seem to have gained? In essence, this is a story about privilege and about our little messenger pigeon, who now is no longer seen as a bird by his former peers, but will also never be a man. And so what will he do? So ink work and printmaking are kind of my early home in art. These are the things that I always come back to in the work that I do. This is another series of work of mine called Los Pioneros, or The Pioneers, and it is specifically a story that brings together local and global. So all of the birds in this series are native to Wisconsin and migratory to Mexico. It's not an either or. FYI, the bald eagle, our national emblem, is a Canadian and Mexican immigrant. So here are some of the other birds from the series, and the incredible thing about these birds is that a lot of them fly in multi-species flocks. And the songbird specifically, since they're prey, will fly at night to avoid predators, and they'll memorize the patterns of the constellations to find their way. And I think that says something really beautiful about migration. It's not just an act of moving from one place to another, but a pioneering thing. This is my newest series from the summer called The Glow Beavers. And again, this is all about parts of the whole, breaking that either-or paradigm. We've gotten in a lot of trouble in politics because of the either-or and because of false dichotomies. And so this piece, in this series in general, I'm bringing together these seemingly different sides, right? So here we've got the supposed angels and harpies. You ever think it's kind of funny how, depending on how we want to describe women in society, we refer to them as angels when we think they're pure and they're beautiful, and we call them harpies when they're ugly and shrewd. But they're both damn birds. But as long as you can differentiate two things, or the same thing, by two names, you can start a war. This piece is called Hybrid. This is one of a number of gun dogs that I've drawn over the years. You can see up close on his muzzle, he's branded a hybrid. In this piece, showing the evolution from wolf to dog. The dog, an animal that is often described as man's best friend, and has evolved for the purpose of service. So this next part, I'm going to get into the context of my work. I've shared some of my own personal fine artwork and one of my community projects. This next part is about community art specifically and public work. So this image, significantly lighter and happier than some of those darker, heavier ink works, but still getting at that same idea of connecting the different parts of the whole. Now, the reason that I start with this one, this piece I did with a group of high school students addressing the topic of immigration within their neighborhood. And we put this at an intersection that was previously in neglect to see how we could change that space. How can you change the way people interact with the public space because of public art? While also talking meaningfully about a subject that is important to the community. And so this image is a compilation of all the students' drawings of different species of butterflies and crops that are native to Wisconsin. But the butterflies are migratory and the crops have come here with people and with domestication. The thing that I think is perhaps the biggest challenge with community art is learning how to balance the positivity that's necessary to have a vision for what you want for a community with the reality that may not always be happy. I think any artist that has ever actually worked in schools and worked with students that are at schools that receive these programs, it's not all happy. And I struggle a little bit in community art because a lot of the times I worry that it can become self-congratulatory. There are a lot of community murals of multicultural children holding hands under a rainbow, and the sentiment is really nice, but we haven't accomplished that yet. And in the midst of that, nonprofit work, social justice work, social practice work, there's a lot of struggle over what the work's worth is. And for myself, as a self-employed artist and educator, I find myself in the position of having to advocate for myself while also advocating for the students that I'm working with. And that's going to become increasingly a part of the dialogue as we work on increasing representation among the people who are working with youth. And so this is another community mural that I worked on with the students at Goodman Community Center in Madison. And the teens on this project specifically wanted to talk about teen suicide and community violence. Now, the other struggle of public work is that when you take art out of a gallery and put it in a public space, you're not putting it in front of an audience that didn't ask to be an audience. And I think that's the other reason why community art tends to lean positive, tends to lean sunny, happy, let's focus on the positive, right? So with these students, they wanted to talk about some really heavy stuff. And one of the things that they expressed as a frustration was when adults try to shelter them from what's going on. They said they don't want to be sheltered. They want to be included in the conversation. They want to be included in the solution. And so the image that we ended up coming up with, the students, was inspired by a quote that one of the students shared, that you can read it, you can hopefully read it a little bit, but that the walls we build to keep out the sadness also keep out the joy. And so this is the resulting image from that quote. I do a lot of curatorial projects as well, and this is one of my recent ones from the summertime. This was a project at Promega, which is a biopharmaceutical company based out of Madison. And the important thing with working on this project, so the title of the show was Intertwined, and specifically it brought together artists who were either politically or philosophically engaged in discussing the environment. And it was important to me to be able to do this kind of show in a corporate space. A lot of the times, I think the work that we see ourselves surrounded by in the workplace, in public spaces, it tends to function as decoration, going back to the painter without any ethical cause, is merely a decorator. And for myself, I don't want to be a decorator. Right? I want to bring a meaningful conversation into a space where people spend a good chunk of their day. This piece is by Rina Yoon. It's called Earth Between In and Young. And In Young in Korean is it's a concept that loosely translates to cause and effect. It's understanding that everything has a cause and effect. And so the metaphor that she uses in her work is that a sunflower seed already has the predetermined DNA to become a sunflower seed. But it depends on the soil that it's planted in order to grow. And so these things are interdependent. It's not an either or. Mural, another one of the artists in the show, talking about her work, and her work specifically is about language and how that shapes our identities. And Yummy Chung created the piece here, called Massacre Camouflage. And the image that's repeated here, 70 yards of fabric, is from the Korean War. And the profound thing that she said about this work was that, we see this trauma repeated across history, over and over and over again. We see it right now happening in Syria. And so this image doesn't go away, but we, as the creators of it, can disrupt it. And so the fabric here spill down at the ends. We can cut this pattern. We can stop it. And so the note that I want to end on is responsibility. I've discussed some of my projects, some of my fine artwork projects, my work in public spaces and with students, and also my curatorial work with other artists. at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so whose responsibility is it to carry forward these conversations? The images I'm sharing now are from 6 years ago. When I first moved to Wisconsin, I started teaching in the Milwaukee Public School District, and this was right at the beginning of my second year of teaching. I had finished up summer school 2 weeks before. During that time, Scott Walker's Act 10 happened. A lot of the teachers lost their jobs. I did not lose mine. But when I returned to class the day before to make sure that everything was in order before I had to come in to teach the next day, this is how I found my classroom. And nobody was there to be able to help clean that up. And had I not been there, I would not have known until I showed up the next day. And had I not taken pictures, nobody else would know that this happened. But this kind of stuff happens, and it happens more often than I think most people are aware of or would like to admit. And so the question is, whose job is it to clean the mess up? Whose job is it? And it's unfair for me to ask that, because it's not an easy answer. That day it was me. Right? That day I had to be the one to straighten up that classroom and take pictures so that I could come back to them later. So the reason I ask that question, as hard as it is to answer, is because it's both everyone's and no one's job, right? So it's no one's job to have to deal with this on a regular basis. It is everyone's job to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't repeat. We can disrupt the pattern. And I think a lot of times the trap we fall into in society is that we praise the people who are always willing to clean up the mess until one day they are not. And then the day they are not willing to clean up the mess, we're upset. Why did they stop? And we gotta dig one layer deeper and ask, well, why did they have to clean it up in the first place, or the second place, or the third place? And so I lied about that being the final thing, but artists get asked a lot about whether it's the responsibility of artists to be the messengers, to be the mirror for society. And I think yes, in the sense that yes, it's everyone's responsibility to be the messengers and to be the mirrors of what we want to see. And maybe if we are able to communicate about these things on a more regular basis, we don't have to get to the hard place where people are scared of being the messenger. I'm terrible with this clicker, I never learned. But we are our environment. What we do sets a precedent. And what we repeatedly do becomes who we are. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I'm having a great time. Very well. Our next presenter is Thailand Soil.
Howdy. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. Man, that was amazing. Like to hear your presentations and see your work. Like it's amazing. Thank you, Ripon College, for having me, and thank you, Raphael, for inviting me to speak. I'm just going to take you guys to a few images of artwork that I've produced over my career. As Raphael said at the beginning, my work deals primarily with race and identity, specifically from a Black perspective, or at least this one Black man's perspective. I can't speak for all Black people, but I can speak pretty confidently for myself, which most people should be able to. This first series that I'm going to show is called the Slave Series, and this was produced shortly after I graduated from graduate school and I moved back to Michigan from New York. And somehow I was caught in corporate America for 8 years, and so my productivity was pretty low during that period. And so I only produce maybe 2 or 3 paintings like a year. Like that's literally, or maybe 1 painting a year, just depending upon what was going on. And so during trying to produce a painting, I was thinking about sort of like how I felt at that specific time, sort of like a slave going into work every day doing this type of repetitive sort of process, paperwork, making tons of money for organizations and not really reaping the benefits from it. And so I don't know if you guys are familiar with this image of a diagram of a slave ship, if you've ever been to like an African American studies class and you've seen this sort of iconography. And I always thought about the power, like how powerful that image is to see people stuffed into compartments in that way. And so, wow, this is a sensitive clicker. And so I created this paintings called, a series of paintings called Boxes. Actually, my thesis project for graduate school was the first one that I did. It was 5 people crammed into a box on an imaginary slave ship. I haven't been able to find an image from that, but these are 2 done shortly after that. And these are psychological spaces. I wanted to make that clear. Usually if you see nudity in any of my work, it usually represents a psychological space. And so I was thinking about myself, specifically thinking about myself in that I created a prison of my own design by getting caught, trapped in corporate America and working every day. And so that's why I have these sort of nude figures and sort of, because when you're in your own head, you're nude and there's no type of protection from the environment. And so I literally thought about the box as a metaphor for this prison that I trapped myself in, going into work day in and day out. And so you have these people stuck in a box and you don't really know how they got there, and there's a light source emitting from some ambiguous place, but it's illuminated in a way. And I often feel sometimes when we put ourselves in situations that we didn't intend to, but when you really follow the decisions that you make, you sometimes are the architect of like your own problems. And so that's what I was thinking about during this particular series. This next series, and this is still following the same series, thinking about slave ships, thinking about the auctioning block and how slaves are often put on presentation to sell off of being strong, being hard workers, being obedient in that way. And those are still very similar things that follow sort of corporate America. And so this was a painting I did called Systemic, pretty much from the same series. And once again, nudity, ambiguous sort of light source, but nevertheless, it's illuminating, and these people are in a psychological space being put on presentation because of the decisions that they've made. I tried to get rid of all of the features just so it can seem more just human as opposed to an individual in that regard. The next, so shortly after that, I was actually laid off from corporate America I was there for 8 years. I was doing great, until I wasn't. And so being laid off from corporate America, to be cliche, when someone says it was the best thing yet the worst thing that ever happened to them, I'm totally that cliche. That's exactly what it was, but you don't feel it in that moment. Because when you don't have a job and you have bills to pay, man, like you really, really get stressed out about it. So during this period while I was looking for a job, I had nothing to do but paint and send out resumes and go on job interviews. And so I was thinking about what it is that I wanted to paint next, because I was no longer in this box that I created. And I was noticing like all of these negative images of people of color in the media. And so I wanted to create these large-scale portraits of people of color, which would be really big, beautiful, and bold, so that it would engage the viewer, to sort of be like an inoculation against these negative images and negative stereotypes of people of color that are quite often portrayed in the media. And so this was the first one that I did in that series when I was laid off, and I did this for approximately 2 years, just large-scale portraits, and most of these are probably like 5 by 4 feet. They're all like oversized. This is Lady in Red, not Jean Hill. And this is a friend of mine, Whitney Syphax Walker. She's a poet host in Detroit. Pretty popular around the community as an activist. Works with youth, and so like her face actually in Detroit was really like something that the community really connected with the community. This is my grandmother. It's called Day Queen Flora. It's my grandmother. I love my grandmother and everything that she represents. That's me. This was a picture that I did called the Gwen and Rodney Project, because my parents are called Gwen. My father's name is Rodney. My mother's name is Gwen. And I often think of myself as a project because while my parents aren't together, if you ever met them, there's no way you would ever think that these 2 people would like each other to produce me. And so I think I'm kind of like a weird project, which is probably why I have so many issues going out into the world. No, seriously. This was portrait of my nephew. This was actually, it was supposed to start off as a collaboration with a t-shirt company called the Dirt Label in Detroit, where they had like this cartoon character of a boy wearing an old school airplane helmet and with a pipe in his mouth. And so the owner of the company contacted me and wanted me to do something in my style to represent their logo. And so I went and got an old school airplane helmet and had my nephew model for me. And the t-shirt company, they didn't like it because he said it was too realistic and it just kind of looked dark. And I was like, but you've seen my work. Like, what did you think that I was going to do? Like, when I produced that. And so it never worked out, but I kept the painting and I really liked it. Just because my nephew was so young and his commitment to like modeling and like the seriousness on his face throughout the project, I thought really worked. But it also still kind of falls in line with that playing on image, because this is called Wonder Boy mugshot, and in that way of portraying like such a young African American male in this sort of stereotypical mugshot, which has kind of become the bane of the African American reputation, right now. So then murals. So in addition to like doing these types of paintings, somehow, I wouldn't say it's an accident. There was a contest in Detroit. They had opened a new Whole Foods, yay, which was like a really well, Detroit has this reputation for being a food desert with not a lot of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and so expensive Whole Foods was the talk of the town, and they decided to build one in Midtown. And to get the neighborhood excited, they put out a contest to get some people to come and paint 4 murals on the back of Whole Foods. After about 50 emails from friends and family telling me that I should enter this contest, I decided to do so. And then I made it through the first round, which surprised me. And then, because I'd never painted a mural up to that point, I had no interest in painting murals. Even now, I still don't know if I'm that interested in painting murals, but I just kept going through the process, refining it, went before the panel and ended up being one of the 4 people to paint a mural on Whole Foods. And so this was like one of the initial sketches for it, just a really small, crude acrylic sketch of it. And this is how the original ended up being. So the small one was like 18 by 24, like it's a small paper, and this is 23 feet by 12, like 12 and a half feet tall. Like really large scale. Each one of those panels is approximately 6 feet tall and 70 pounds. And so I kind of had to paint it like a puzzle, like on each image. And so if you saw me, I'm only 5'10", so I'm lifting these like 6 foot, 70 pound panels trying to like paint on them. Yeah, that was a lot of stress. But I'm really happy with how this turned out. This is an image of my friend Keisha. This is her son, who's now a teenager. But at this time, that spot where the green is over there, that's where the Whole Food is now. It just used to be like a green field that was there in the area. And so we got a topographical view of a map of that particular spot in Midtown. And the boy is actually in a pose of a statue in Detroit called the Spirit of Detroit, which is a large-scale statue downtown by sculptor Marshall Fredericks. And it has like a large Greek white man holding like a family in one hand and a son in another. And so one thing I wanted to do was like kind of take the pose but remove some of the typical tropes that romanticize that statue, and then put like a young African-American male in the same position to kind of still evoke the same idea, but something that I thought was more relevant to the city at that time. And so this was the first one that I did, which just led to more murals happening. So then I was commissioned by the Museum of So then I was commissioned, after doing that, I was contacted by the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit to paint a mural for a show they had coming up commemorating the 100-year anniversary of Diego Rivera. He has a mural in the Detroit Institute of Arts, his industry murals. And so I had the opportunity to collaborate with Hank Willis Thomas, who's a really famous conceptual photographer from New York, and the ideal of the show was to get international artists to design murals and get local Detroit artists to paint them, which caused a lot of controversy because it's like there's enough artists in Detroit, you don't need to go outside of the city to get people to design murals. Which they saw once this happened, trying to collaborate with Hank Willis Thomas, which was very, very stressful because I didn't even get to speak to him. I got to speak to his assistant. Then at one point I was able to speak to his assistant's assistant. And so I figured I have not arrived as an artist until I can get an assistant who has an assistant. But this was the initial sketch they sent me on sort of what they wanted. And so there were like a lot of logistical issues with this to scale, etc. And so I kind of redesigned it in a way that kind of matched their sensibilities, and we were going back and forth for like 2 weeks, and it was literally 5 days before the show was supposed to start, and I'm like, you have to make a decision on what's gonna happen or not, and then the museum director just told me to paint it, and so this was the initial sketch, and that's how the mural ended up being, and this is called Radiant Beauty, and this is about the Belleville Three, so 3 gentlemen who were responsible for starting techno music in Detroit, Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunders, and Derek May. And in the background, there are like 2 maidens with a fire burning in the city, and that's actually like an image from the Detroit city flag, which represents like the fire of I forgot the exact year, but it happened in the 1800s. And so that's the iconography in the background, and in the foreground, he wanted to sort of represent this way that white culture has latched on to like black music, and so he wanted like a cloned type of white man in the foreground, because at first I put all of these different races, people had iPhones, it looked like a real crowd, and then no, make them all the exact same person. So yeah, that's what happened. This another image, that was the actual second mural that I got to paint for them. I painted a mural at first, and I was collaborating with a woman in California named Andrea Bowers, who's a pretty famous social activist, artist, brilliant draftsman, and like printmaker. But she wanted a mural to commemorate the D15 fast food workers movement. If you guys are familiar with that, where fast food workers have been protesting around the country to receive $15 an hour. And so we talked about an image, and she wanted something painted sort of like a Russian socialist or communist propaganda poster. And so this is how that mural turned out. And so this was a woman at a protest in Detroit, and so snapped a picture of her and just sort of stylized it to sort of kind of give the impression of a propaganda poster. And that's how that mural turned out. And it's pretty in line. Stylistically, these murals are the point of departure for me, but it's in line, like in terms of the collaboration with the artists that I was able to work with. This was a painting. I was in a project with the Detroit Institute of Arts where they selected 3 artists and gave us pianos and told us to paint them, and then they would put them in prominent places around the city. And so this was a piano I painted with called like a study for Detroit Freeze. And so it sort of incorporates my current series, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's people wearing masks of famous Detroit musicians with a small painting that was attached to the facade of the piano. And then I painted it black and gold all over, and then this went on Belle Island in a conservatory, which is a pretty popular spot in Detroit. And so that was really awesome to be a part of that project. And then last year I was commissioned by Quicken Loans Corporation to paint their VIP hallway. And so I took that smaller painting that was on the piano and just blew it up to 56.6 feet by 16 feet tall. And so it takes up the entire hallway. Around the corner, I don't know if you can see famous hip-hop producer Jay Dilla, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, and Stevie Wonder, like taking up the whole hallway. And then the flowers were actually painted by the teenagers that I worked with at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And so with the commission I received, I was able to pay teenagers to come in and actually be a part of the mural project. And so that was really, really awesome. This is the one that I just finished last week. So I did this in 5 days. This is called We Hope for Better Things, which is a quote from the Detroit City. It's on the Detroit City flag written in Latin. And when I originally designed this, I had a lot of the tropes that were on the flag, and then I decided to just keep reducing it down until I just got down to the image of my niece and nephew. This was really special for me just because my niece last year, she was diagnosed with this rare form of cancer, which is really specific to African Americans, and it appears between ages of 9 and 12. And she had just turned 12, and we found out that she had this cancer, and so that was really, really challenging for our whole family. And so this year, she just had her first cancer-free, 13th birthday, and it was this really exciting thing. And so I was really excited to get her on the wall, as well as her and her brother. And so he's the little boy who had the pipe in his mouth. He's a little older now on that one. And so, yeah, I was just able to get them on the wall for this big mural festival called Murals in the Market, which actually starts today in Detroit. And it's the only international art festival in the state of Michigan right now. And so, but this is recent, a week ago. Yeah.
It's on Instagram.
It's on Instagram. Yeah. Black and Blue, this is series, it's a series that I'm working on now concurrently with my painting series, but this is a series where sort of I'm trying to examine the relationship, the relationship and the reputation of law enforcement to African Americans. And so while I am not anti-police officer, I am not blind to the tons of images that we see quite often of like law enforcement acting less than they should in terms of like what their position in society. And one thing that constantly troubles me is that when we see these blatant disregard for life at the expense of the power of the law, we don't really have police officers speaking out against these sorts of things. And I think because of the silence of police officers in that regard, it can be pretty challenging to maintain the reputation of an organization that's supposed to serve and protect when you don't speak out on you when your peers are doing anything but that. And so I had the image of a police academy with 40 figures. This is like 8 by 5 feet, so it's a really large scale charcoal drawing. And I literally spent, I don't know how long, just drawing like every day, how many hours for a month, drawing in all of the figures, and I drew in all of the faces. And when I was done, I thought it was too pretty, and so I took acrylic paint and whited out all of the features and just let them drip down. And so I'm starting to think about sort of like represent that reputation of law enforcement losing its integrity. And so that's what the drips kind of represent, like just sort of like their inability to maintain some type of stability under the weight of their silence in that regard. And this was another one. This particular image was taken, a friend of mine took this in New York last summer, and so it was nice to get a reference photo from something that wasn't in the media, but from somebody who was actually there. This is called Every Now and Then, and this was in a show commemorating the '67 riots in Detroit. This is the 50th anniversary, and so they've been having tons of shows in Detroit to represent that. The other one was 8 by 5 feet. I think this is 7 by 5 feet, so they're both really large charcoal and acrylic drawings. The Battle of Detroit, this was a series that I did while I was at the Red Boy House of Art. It was an artist residency in Detroit, and this whole series is about sort of protecting yourself from toxic environments, be it people who are negative, relationships, and literally like the environment itself of people not taking care of the earth. This is my nephew again. He's, great model. He put on a gas mask for me and got down. But I wanted to like create a series which sort of had this Baroque type of Caravaggio sort of lighting in it to give something that had like an ominous feeling, but you would think of it in terms of like a classic type of feel when you think of the lighting, and so that's why it's lit and structured in that way. The painting, this painting on the right, this is at a show right now at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History for their show representing the '67 riots. And just some more images from that series. Black Masquerade, so this is my current series, the current body of work that I'm doing. And this series kind of is a play on where all of the figures are wearing masks. And in this regard, I'm thinking about how certain African tribes use masks as a way to connect with their ancestors or the spirit world. Particularly, whereas the person who puts on a mask, they're imbued with the spirit of their ancestor, and they sort of serve as a medium between the spirit world and the living world to receive sort of advice or guidance on how to live a better and just life. And so that's sort of just the main premise on why the mask that you're about to see. This is a sculpture by Kiki Smith in the DIA called Lot's Wife. I really like Kiki Smith's sculpture because she's such a strange person. But I really like the idea of Lot's wife, like looking back, and because of the way that the surface texture is, she's turning into a pillar of salt. And so this is a study for Lot's wife, a painting that I'm working on now. But this is Conte on paper, black pencil, just a study for that painting. This is an image from New York a couple of years ago when the mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, had criticized law enforcement for the stop and frisk movement, and then a couple of days after that, 2 police officers were shot and killed. And so when de Blasio was giving the eulogy, or giving a speech at the funeral, law enforcement all turned their backs on the mayor. And the image from that, and I thought it was a very powerful image, just sort of like a line of people kind of showing resistance. And so I painted this. This is called MLK Congregation, MLK. And this is 4 by 10 feet on 3 canvases. because I had to figure out how to get stuff out of my studio. I would paint these big pictures and not be able to get them through the door. So I put them on 3 canvases, and now it can fit through doors. But I wanted to show that same ideal of like showing like that strength of like literally like a vanguard or a bar of people, like sort of like just as a barrier between you. But then also the mask in a way kind of serve as a barrier between the individual's identity and the identity of the person that they're taking over. I also use a lot of iconography from fraternal organizations, class photos, law enforcement photos, and these are just some of the images. This is the Niagara movement. That first one was the skull and crossbones. I think George W. Bush is the guy by the clock. Yeah. So this is a charcoal drawing, class photo 1.5. This is charcoal, mixed media, a charcoal collage and gold leaf on paper, and this is 5 by 4 feet. 3 Graces, Nina Simone, oil on canvas, 5 by 4 feet. This is an image by Kara Walker, and you guys are familiar with her, contemporary artist who does these large-scale cut-out silhouettes, but I've always loved this image of like this woman jumping up in the air and slitting her wrists and like leaping for joy. Like Kara Walker creates some pretty disturbing imagery, but I love like just usually it's in the context of like large-scale installations, but I just love this as like a solo kind of disturbing image. And so I did this drawing sort of kind of like in a tribute to Kara Walker, and so this is a woman with a Kara Walker mask holding scissors, and it's just called Cut Kara Walker, and it was influenced by that. And then this is the painting, which I did a year after I did the drawing, and this was a painting that I did this year called Tableau. And so it's oil on canvas, and this is actually a photo before I finished it, and so like it's embellished with these black jewels like over the whole canvas. This is a painting that I did, was study for an allegory of freedom, Angela Davis. Similar thing, it has jewels on it, but this is a photo before I added the final embellishments. This is called Bhangarh. This is like 5 by 7 feet, oil and glitter on canvas. So this is the first, we were talking about using glitter, and it was like, this is the first time I used it like on here. But it's also like kind of sort of like a tribute to David Hammons, who created the African American flag in New York, and that's why you have these figures kind of like on this flag floating in this sort of nebulous space, and I wanted to use glitter to really push that effect. And then these 2 paintings, these are the ones that are in the Museum of Contemporary Art right now. Class Photo 3 and Class Photo 4, they're both called Black and Beanie. These are oil on canvas with glitter. It's challenging to see, but there are flags in the background actually made out of glitter. And so the masks are actually collaged on with Nina Simone and James Baldwin. But it's still this type of ideal of like people trying to invoke the spirits of their ancestors in a way, but being presented as a fraternal organization. And that's it. Yeah, so you know.
We are running just a little over, but that's okay because I like to look at the pictures. I prepared a couple of questions for the group, but I'm wondering, or maybe Brian, you can help me out. Should we maybe just open it up to the audience first? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought too. I'd love to hear any questions you have for the panel or for any of the artists individually. What's happening out there? If there aren't questions, maybe you just need to think it over for a second. But if there aren't questions, maybe I'll revert back to one of the prepared questions, but I'm happy to take.
So I have a question, which is, if someone is thinking about trying to make a difference politically, I'm wondering what, if you have thoughts on why the fine arts are especially worthwhile as opposed to, say, other means of creating public dialogue, like journalism or maybe direct political lobbying or something. So what is it about the arts that you think you find so valuable?
Before we begin, Travis's question was what makes art more valuable as a communication tool of a political viewpoint as opposed to other means, right?
Well, I would argue rather than it being more valuable, I would argue that it is valuable. I think that specifically why it's so easy to focus on the arts of the fields, of the industries, the arts is the marginalized one, right? So you have the starving artist stigma, you've got the idea that you can't make money from art, that it's impractical because it doesn't work like other commercial endeavors. And so I'd say the reason that it's valuable as a way to talk about politics is both because it's often not tied to commerce, and because when we're aware of the ways in which it is tied to commerce, it can be a really powerful tool and weapon. You know, if we're not aware of the integrity of art, it easily gets either erased and along with the culture and the history, or it gets usurped and used as propaganda, and used as a way to control the populace. And we see that happen too. So I'd say that's why the arts are worth defending.
Now, literally, I was going to say about the art being not being tied to commerce. In that regard, like it holds its importance. Like I'm able to do what I personally do just because I don't have to worry about somebody paying me to create a specific type of image. I'm often surprised if somebody does buy something that I actually create, but nevertheless, that actually makes me feel good because regardless of my message, at least it's out there, the type of thing that I'm trying to produce, and it gets people thinking. Like art changes people, just like people change art, and so I think that's really like an important reason to why it holds up, like politically.
And I would say it goes back to that tie between aesthetics and ethics, in that, you know, there is that sense of judgment and there is that critical view. I mean, we're trained to be critical. I mean, a huge part of our practice is just looking at things and talking about it from every kind of angle we can think of, and being analytical and being critical. And along with that, you know, we're world makers. We imagine. You know, we think of what's possible. We show other ways of existing, you know, rather than just accepting things as they are. And so, I mean, it's so much a part of, you know, how we're trained as professionals, and so much of how we just kind of exist. And I think that in that, you know, it's just a natural tie.
World makers, I like that. Are there other questions from the audience? Yeah, in the back.
Do any of you ever do things that are not overtly political, or is everything you do overtly political?
The question was whether these artists ever make work that is not overtly political.
Yes. The mural I did of my niece and nephew, I wouldn't say was particularly political. Like that was really, really personal for me to do. Not only it's in my neighborhood, it's of my niece and like what she went through. So it was that was unusual. Like usually I don't do sentimental sorts of things, and that was super sentimental. It was all gush and all, yeah, it was all of it.
Yes and no. I would say yes in that I've done work whose goal was not to be political. I've done work on personal narrative, capturing the stories of my family and their journey to come here and establish here. But then in that same vein, everything's political. And so, you know, going back to the show that I curated at Promega, I think a lot of the times we try to separate out politics from everyday life. We try to be careful what conversations we have with coworkers, with church members, or whoever else. And the reality is, like, it's just not actually a separable thing. If your colleagues are volunteering for a particular cause, that's inherently political. So, yes and no. The goal may not always be to deliver a specific political message, knowing that underlying the work, there is always politics in whatever we do.
Yeah, I would say for myself, I've always found it difficult not to make undergraduate training was a very formal program, and it was art about art, and I always found that, you know, a little boring. I always wanted to really try to engage the world in different ways, and so even at times throughout my career when I've tried not to make political work, it's not who I am. So I make the work that I make, and I'm okay with that.
Questions?
Since you are critical in your art frequently of the way things are in the world, particularly injustice, do you get blowback from people who don't like it and who try to oppose you? Can you give some examples of having received some fair or unfair criticism from people who rejected you?
The question was whether the artists receive any critical response from the artwork they put out in the world.
From the Black and Blue series that I did with the law enforcement officers, like actually a lot of it, from police officers and from lawyers. That not that they tried to sue me or anything like that, but lawyers were. This lawyer, I remember she came to the show. I curated a drawing show, and that was a drawing that was actually in it. And this lawyer, you know, she came up to me. She thought it was beautiful, but she was troubled by it. And I said, well, you know, like, what troubles you by it? She's like, because you're saying this about cop, and she went off on this whole long narrative, which was not at all like the message I was trying to get across. But I understand art does that, you know, it's open for that type of interpretation. And so then I explained to her, you know, about, you know, like the reputation of law enforcement in that regard, and she understood it. I'm like, whether you're pro-cop or not, you do understand that their reputation is definitely suffering because of this. Like whether, you know, like you think it or not, like that's just objective, it's not subjective in that regard. And so she left me with, I really like this piece, but I can't buy it because somebody, you know, I have too many cop friends and they just wouldn't like this. And then the Martin Luther King pieces, I've had people, especially on social media, where people are super brave and like they'll just say like anything to you, you know. And I was doing the Martin Luther King, and this artist just kept criticizing me and asking me questions about, why are you doing Martin Luther King like that? Why not Gandhi? And I'm like, because Gandhi's not African American. He has nothing to do with like, what I'm talking about in this regard, you know. And so yes, I have tons of stories, just those two, like right there.
You know, I don't know that I've gotten criticized for the content of my work. I have, like, on that same note, I've gotten the comment, and it's just like, you know, it's really, really beautiful. I would never hang that over my couch. I can't look at that every day. I've gotten the comments like, gosh, you know, that's really, like, it's heavy. It's heavy, and it's in a public space. And for me, I'm like, well, you know, I think it's like okay, good. It got a reaction out of you. You didn't forget about it, like you would have forgotten a flower painting, right? So I don't know, I take it as a compliment when somebody says that the work is impactful in a heavy way. And then somebody else will want to hang it over their couch. So there's that. I'd say where I meet the most resistance is actually the fact that I'm a self-employed artist. And I'm a self-employed artist who will negotiate for pay. And so, you know, I'll get pushback on the value that I assign to my work. And, you know, I mentioned again, you know, what we do sets a precedent, right? And I'm very, for better or worse, I'm very adamant about this. And, you know, you mentioned your 8 years in the corporate world. You know, I was in the corporate world too, right? And I literally did like time studies for a living. I'm pretty good with numbers. And but like people don't expect that. And then as artists, I think, especially in a social practice space, you know, we get asked to donate a lot. We get asked to donate artwork. We get asked to donate time. We're a culture that really loves volunteerism and charity, and that's great in many ways. It speaks of our generosity. It also is not always towards a root solution, and I think the most criticism, the most resistance that I end up in is in conversations where I'm trying to get to something deeper while also advocating that I get paid and the people I work with get paid, and that my numbers are correct when I say what something's going to take. So.
I think for me, the most kind of criticism of my work that I've gotten has been from my family. I come from a pretty big military family, and And so, you know, he's questioned a lot of what I do, you know, in terms of like, you know, anti-war work in particular. And, you know, I always come back to him and say, you know, I'm doing it because of people in the military. I'm doing it because I care about them. I'm doing it because I care about this country, you know, and I'm doing it because, you know, I want to make it better, and I want decisions to be made better, and I want to have that dialogue. So I don't shy away from it, but, you know, it has, I think that's kind of the main place that I've gotten criticism from.
Do we have time for one more? Oh, we're a question in the back. We'll make this the last one. Okay.
So going a bit off to that last question, art is kind of inherently multiple in its interpretation and in meaning, but with political art it seems definitely like there's much more, intention is much more important. Have you ever had a time when the intentions of your work, when what you were trying to get across did not get across, and how did you deal with that?
The question was if the intentions of your work were ever confused by the viewer?
Yes.
They don't know.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that I think that my art was confused by viewers. I definitely, when I talked that series where I talked about blackface, where I was doing large-scale portraits of people of color, while that was a political act that I was doing, like I literally wanted to populate galleries with as many large-scale portraits of people of color in that regard, and, you know, to be confrontational. But at the time, you know, this is when we started to have all the upheavals around the country, you know, like in Ferguson and in New York, et cetera. And I was literally feeling at that moment the work that I was making wasn't as impactful visually enough to really articulate maybe my personal politics. And so that's kind of why I started looking for a different way to kind of still be political, but to still have art that had a strong formal element to it. So that's kind of like why I ended up shifting to the mass series. Like I experimented with other things that just didn't work out. I just didn't put it in between there. But that's why I shifted, because I didn't think this thing that I was doing here was getting the message across that I wanted it to.
I would say for myself, you know, the intention of my work and the context in which it's presented are really important. You know, especially a lot of like my gallery-based work, you know, being able to have artist talks and, you know, other like material that explains the work or talks about the work and the intention behind it. I mean, I really do try to conceptually think about how I'm addressing the issues I'm addressing, what I'm trying to say in addressing that way. And I mean, I think I try to find formats in which I can, you know, be allowed to have that conversation.
I had a project I ended up not doing, actually. That's what I ended up thinking. I had a project I ended up not doing because of the direction, that the environment was making it go in. And so a couple of years ago, I was attacked at knife point in Madison, and I was lucky, right? Like I screamed, I got away. He hit me, but otherwise I was fine, right? So I got away, and I got a really good look at him, and I was able to file a report, and I had his DNA sample on my blouse, and so I was able to give all the information over to police, did all the right things. He did not get caught. A month later, in the same spot where I was attacked, another woman was assaulted and raped. Now, there wasn't necessarily a correlation, but there could have been, and the reaction from the community was, you know, like it was in some ways very heartwarming because people were outraged. People were outraged, and there was a big rally, a lot of people coming out marching to take back the bike path where this had happened. And the part that had unsettled me is that that the reaction only happens after there's been a crisis. And the thing is, there'd actually, like once I'd done my research, there'd been a few different attacks on the bike path that summer, not just mine and not just the woman who was attacked after me. It's like, okay, so we know that safety is an issue. We know that maybe lighting is an issue. And we also know that we're only able to track somebody down after we have their DNA, right? And then it's we're basically waiting for them to attack again to be able to do anything about it. And so I started to do a project about us being reactive instead of proactive, and about what it would take to be proactive in these conversations to prevent violence, to change our society essentially from one that makes this okay until it happens, right? So once I started talking about the project, I got contacted and interviewed, and also because my story was one of the ones from this bike path, contacted and interviewed by different journalists, and there was one who wanted to put my face next to the identified attacker. And at that point, I just stopped. I'm like, you know what? Like, this is not actually getting better. I'm here talking about the ways in which the media, the law enforcement, the community can be more proactive instead of reactive to each of these things. Because there's just multiple like fail points that I saw in the process when addressing a violent attack, and it was actually creating a situation that might have been unsafe for me. So I stopped. Yeah, I stopped and did not continue the project. And so I guess I have had a case where my intent was to talk about why these things happen and how we can change it. I was not able to beat the system. Yeah.
Okay, well, that is all the time I think we're going to have for today. So please join me in thanking Thailand Soil, Jeremy Dow, and Bhangarh. I think at least a component of this panel will be retiring to Roadhouse, so if you have a couple questions for us, we'll be having a beer over there. For my students who are lucky enough to be at the panel, sign-in sheets are up here.
Just one last quick announcement. Our next event will be on October 2nd at 4:30 right here in Little Theater. Thank you very much.